Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The lighthouse. I've been the keeper of the Black Rock Lighthouse for 11 years now. 11 years of solitude, punctuated only by supply deliveries and the occasional relief keeper when I take my twice-yearly leave. 11 years of watching the sea crash against the rocks, of maintaining the light that guides ships safely past the treacherous coastline of northern Maine. 11 years without incident, until 3 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when I first noticed something unusual. The weather had been foul for days, a nor'easter hammering the coast with rain and wind that howled through every crack in the lighthouse tower. I was in the lantern room, polishing the brass and checking the mechanism that rotates the great Fresnel lens, when I saw it through the streaming glass, a vessel where no vessel should be. The shipping lanes run well away from Black Rock Point. That's the whole point of the lighthouse, to warn sailors of the deadly rocks that extend nearly a mile offshore. No captain in his right mind would bring a ship so close, especially in weather like this. Yet there it was. A dark silhouette against the darker sea, its outline blurred by sheets of rain. A schooner, I thought, though it was difficult to be certain at that distance and in such conditions. Two-masted with what looked like square-rigged sails, though they appeared to be furled. I grabbed my binoculars for a better look, but by then the ship had vanished into the gloom. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps, or some floating debris that my mind had shaped into something familiar. I'd been alone too long, that was all. But the next evening it was there again. In almost the same spot, despite winds that should have driven any vessel miles off course overnight. This time I was ready with the binoculars, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was indeed a schooner, but unlike any modern vessel I'd ever seen. It looked old, ancient even. The wood of its hull was dark and weathered, its sails tattered where they hung from the yards, and there was no movement on deck. No running lights, nothing to indicate that anyone was aboard. I reached for the marine radio, intending to contact the Coast Guard. There was a vessel in distress, possibly adrift, dangerously close to the rocks. But as my hand touched the transmitter, the ship vanished again, not gradually, fading into the mist, but all at once. One moment it was there, the next, open sea. I sat down heavily in my chair, the radio forgotten in my hand. What had I just seen? Was I losing my mind out here, alone with the endless sea and sky? That night I barely slept. The wind had died down somewhat, but the rain continued to beat against my windows, and the foghorn sounded its mournful note every 30 seconds. I kept thinking about the ship, its weathered hull, its empty deck. Where had it come from? Where had it gone? In the morning, I searched the maritime registry online. The lighthouse has satellite internet, now slow and unreliable, but better than nothing. I looked for any reports of missing vessels, any distress calls from the area. There was nothing. On a whim, I began searching historical records instead. Old shipwrecks, vessels lost off the Maine coast. It took hours, but eventually I found something that made my heart skip a beat. The Elizabeth Dane, a trading schooner out of Boston, lost with all hands off Black Rock Point in November of 1887. The description matched what I had seen, a two-masted square-rigger, approximately 90 feet in length. There was even a grainy photograph taken dockside before her final voyage. It was the same ship, I was certain of it. But that was impossible. The Elizabeth Dane had sunk 136 years ago. What I'd seen couldn't be real. Yet for the next week, the schooner appeared every evening, always in the same spot, always deserted. Sometimes it remained visible for hours, other times it vanished within minutes. I began to document the sightings, taking photographs when possible, though they always came out blurry or strangely distorted, as if the camera couldn't quite capture what I was seeing. And then on the 8th night, something changed. The schooner was closer to the lighthouse than it had ever been before, close enough that I could make out details without the binoculars. The name on the stern, barely legible through years of weathering. Elizabeth Dane, and for the first time there was someone on deck. A solitary figure stood at the bow, facing the lighthouse. Even at that distance, I could tell it was a man, dressed in what appeared to be a captain's coat and hat from another century. He stood perfectly still, staring directly at me. Though I couldn't see his face clearly, I had the unsettling feeling that he could see mine. I raised my hand in greeting, or perhaps in warning. The figure did not respond. And then I heard it, faint but distinct over the sound of the waves, a bell, the ship's bell ringing out across the water. 3 slow, deliberate rings followed by silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was no wind to move that bell, no living hand to ring it. I watched, transfixed, as the figure at the bow finally moved. He raised his arm and pointed not at the lighthouse, but at something beyond it, inland. Then both he and the ship faded from view, dissolving like morning mist under the sun. I should have reported the sightings. Should have called the Coast Guard, or at least my supervisor at the Maritime Safety Authority. But what would I have said? That I was seeing a ghost ship, that I was receiving messages from a vessel that had sunk over a century ago. they would have removed me from my post, sent me for psychiatric evaluation. And despite everything, I didn't want to leave the lighthouse. Not yet. Instead, I began to research the Elizabeth Dane more thoroughly. The lighthouse's archives contain logbooks dating back to its construction in 1855, including entries from the time of the shipwreck. The keeper then had been a man named Ephraim Hollis, and his account of the disaster was detailed and disturbing. According to Hollis, the Elizabeth Dane had been deliberately lured onto the rocks. The lighthouse light had been extinguished that night and false lights displayed on the shore. 19 souls had perished, including the captain, one James Malone, but the most troubling part was Hollis's assertion that he had not been responsible for the deception. He claimed that someone else had gained access to the lighthouse that night, overpowered him, and doused the light. Someone who wanted the Elizabeth Dane to founder, someone who had been waiting for that specific ship. Hollis never identified the saboteur, and his account was eventually dismissed as the ravings of a man driven to madness by guilt. He was removed from his post 6 months later and committed to an asylum, where he died within the year. The official report concluded that Hollis himself had neglected his duties, allowing the light to go out through carelessness or deliberate malice. The families of those lost on the Elizabeth Dane never received justice. That night I waited for the ghost ship to appear again, but the sea remained empty. The next night as well, had the visitations ended, had Captain Malone, for I was now convinced that the figure on deck had been the doomed captain, said all he needed to say. But what had he been trying to tell me? What had he been pointing at? On the third night after the ship's disappearance, I descended from the tower and walked the path to the keeper's cottage where I lived. It was a clear night for once, the stars brilliant overhead, the moon casting silver light across the water. As I approached the cottage, I noticed something unusual. The door to the old storage shed was ajar. The shed was a remnant from an earlier time, a small stone building that predated even the lighthouse. I rarely went inside. It contained mostly junk left by previous keepers, and the Maritime Safety Authority had long since moved all essential supplies to the main storeroom in the lighthouse itself. But I was certain I'd seen the shed door closed earlier that day. Had the wind blown it open, I approached cautiously, pulling my flashlight from my pocket. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs and dust. Old paint cans, coils of rope, broken furniture, the accumulated debris of generations of lighthouse keepers. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. I was about to close the door and leave when my light caught something on the far wall. A section of stone that looked different from the rest, cleaner somehow, less weathered. I moved closer, examining it carefully. It wasn't my imagination. A rectangular section of the wall, about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, was made of newer stone than the surrounding structure. It had been carefully matched to the original, but once you noticed the difference, it was unmistakable. Someone had sealed up an opening in that wall. I ran my hand over the stones, feeling the mortar between them. It was solid but not as hardened with age as the rest of the wall. This work might have been done decades ago, but not centuries. What lay behind this sealed section? A window, a doorway, and why had it been closed up? I returned to the lighthouse, my mind racing. I pulled out the old architectural plans of the station, studying them by lamplight until the early hours of the morning. According to the original drawings, there had indeed been a doorway in that wall of the shed. It had led to a cellar, a storage space built into the natural caverns beneath Blackrock Point, but the cellar wasn't on any of the more recent plans. It had been erased from the official record sometime in the early 1900s. Around the same time that Ephraim Hollis had died in the asylum. The next day I returned to the shed with tools. I knew I shouldn't be doing this. Altering a historical structure was strictly against regulations, but something drove me forward. The ghost of Captain Malone had been pointing toward the shore, toward this shed. He wanted me to find what was hidden here. It took hours of work with a chisel and hammer to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. Behind the newer stones was a wooden door, swollen with damp and sealed shut by time. I forced it open, wincing at the crack of splitting wood. Beyond lay darkness. My flashlight revealed a narrow stone staircase descending into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite identify, something organic and unpleasant. I should have waited for daylight, should have called someone, told them what I'd found, but I didn't. Instead, I began to descend the stairs, the beam of my flashlight leading the way. The staircase curved downward, following the natural contours of the rock. After about 20 steps, it opened into a larger space, a chamber carved partly by nature and partly by human hands. My light played across walls of raw stone, slick with moisture. The floor was earthen, packed hard by years of use. And there were things in the room, crates and barrels mostly, their wood rotted and collapsing after more than a century of abandonment. I approached one that was still relatively intact, prying off the lid with my chisel. Inside were bottles, dozens of them, packed in straw. I pulled one out, wiping away the grime with my sleeve. The label was faded but still legible. Fine French brandy, dated 1885. I opened another crate, more bottles, different shapes this time. Whiskey from Scotland, rum from Jamaica. This was a smuggler's cache. A hidden storage room for contraband alcohol, likely used during Maine's early Prohibition era, which began in 1851. The lighthouse keeper, perhaps Hollis himself, perhaps his predecessors, had been supplementing their income by helping smugglers bring illegal spirits ashore. But this didn't explain the fate of the Elizabeth Dane. Why would smugglers destroy a ship that was bringing them goods? Unless I moved deeper into the chamber, my light revealing another doorway at the far end. This one stood open, leading to a second room, smaller than the first. As I stepped through, my foot struck something that clattered across the stone floor. I directed my light downward and froze. A bone. Human by the look of it, part of a finger, and it wasn't alone. The floor of this second chamber was littered with human remains. Skulls, ribs, femurs, the disarticulated skeletons of multiple individuals, scattered as if they'd been carelessly dumped. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw the far wall of the chamber and what was written there. Someone had painted a message in what looked horribly like dried blood. The Dane knew. The Dane had T.O. sink. Below this, in different handwriting, more desperate and uneven, "Forgive me." I didn't know what they would do. And finally, in yet another hand, the letters small and precise. 19 souls for 19 years of prosperity. The sea gives. The sea takes. I stood there trembling as the pieces fell into place. The Elizabeth Dane hadn't been sunk for its cargo. It had been sunk because someone on board, the captain, had discovered the smuggling operation, and not just smuggling. The human remains suggested something far worse: sacrifice. 19 souls traded for 19 years of prosperity, whatever that meant to the people who had committed this atrocity. I needed to get out to report what I'd found. This was evidence of historical crimes, yes, but also a matter for the police. Those remains deserved proper investigation, proper burial. I turned to leave, and my flashlight flickered, then died. The darkness was absolute. I had no backup light, no matches, nothing but my phone, and of course there was no signal this far underground. I stood perfectly still, fighting down panic. I just needed to retrace my steps. The staircase wasn't far. I could feel my way back. I took one step, then another, my hands outstretched before me. My fingers brushed stone, and I oriented myself, turning toward where I thought the first chamber lay. That's when I heard it. The sound of the wooden door at the top of the stairs creaking closed, followed by the unmistakable scrape of stone against stone. Someone was replacing the wall I had dismantled. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. "Is someone there? I need help." No response, just the continued sound of masonry being rebuilt. "Please," I shouted louder now, stumbling forward in the darkness. "I'm trapped down here." My foot caught on something, one of the bones, perhaps, and I fell, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my wrist, but I scrambled back to my feet, desperate now. I found the doorway to the first chamber by touch, then the base of the stairs. I began to climb, one hand on the wall for guidance, the other cradled against my chest. "Stop," I yelled as I ascended. "Please, there's someone down here." I reached the top of the stairs just as the last stone was being set in place. Through the narrowing gap, I caught a glimpse of the figure on the other side. Not a person, not really. A silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness, with no discernible features except for what might have been a captain's hat. "No," I thrust my good hand through the gap, but it was too late. The stone slid into place, crushing my fingers against the frame. I screamed, pulling back my mangled hand. Blood dripped from my fingertips, invisible in the darkness but warm against my skin. I was sealed in. Buried alive in a tomb that had claimed who knew how many victims before me. I sank down on the stairs, cradling my injured hand and wrist. My phone had no signal, but it still had battery. I activated the screen, using its faint light to examine my surroundings. The door was solid, the new stonework impenetrable without tools. I was trapped. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the phone screen, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. An opening in the wall of the staircase just a few steps down from the top. It was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and it hadn't been visible from below. I directed my phone's light into the opening. It revealed another passage, this one rougher, more like a natural tunnel than a constructed walkway. It seemed to slope upward. With no other options, I began to crawl through the opening, wincing as my injured hand and wrist protested. The passage was tight, the rock scraping against my shoulders. After a few yards, it widened enough that I could stand, though hunched over. The tunnel continued upward, sometimes so steeply that I had to use both hands to pull myself up, ignoring the pain. My phone battery was draining quickly, its light growing dimmer. And then I heard the sea, the distant crash of waves, the whistle of wind. The tunnel was leading toward the coastline. I moved faster now, hope giving me strength. The passage twisted and turned, following what must have been natural fissures in the rock, and finally I saw it, a glimmer of moonlight ahead. The tunnel ended in a narrow opening on the face of the cliff, about 20 feet above the water. It was barely wide enough for me to fit through, and beyond was a sheer drop to the rocks and waves below. I was free of the chamber, but still trapped. There was no way down the cliff face, not without climbing equipment. And even if I could descend, the rocks below were treacherous, constantly battered by waves. I sat in the mouth of the cave, my back against one wall, considering my options. My phone was nearly dead. No one would miss me for days, the supply boat wasn't due for another week, and I wasn't expected to check in with the mainland until my monthly report. As the adrenaline ebbed, the pain in my hand and wrist intensified. In the faint light of my dying phone, I could see that 2 fingers were definitely broken, possibly crushed beyond repair. My wrist might have been fractured in the fall as well. I needed help, and soon, but how? And then I saw it out on the water, appearing silently through the night mist, the Elizabeth Dane. Closer than ever before, its weathered hull gleaming dully in the moonlight. Its decks were no longer empty. Figures moved about the ship, indistinct, shadowy forms that might have been men. And at the bow, standing just as he had before, was the captain, James Malone, if my research was correct. The man who had discovered the dark secret of Blackrock Lighthouse and paid for that knowledge with his life and the lives of his crew. He was looking directly at me, his face still obscured by distance and shadow. But I could feel his gaze, as tangible as a physical touch. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his arm and pointed not at me this time, but at something to my right, further along the cliff face. I turned my head, following his gesture. At first I saw nothing but rock and scrub brush, but then, as my eyes adjusted, I made out a faint path cutting across the cliff. It was narrow and precarious, but it appeared to lead upward, toward the top of Blackrock Point. I looked back at the ghost ship, at its spectral captain. "Thank you," I whispered, though there was no way he could hear me over the sound of the waves. As if in response, the ship's bell rang out 3 slow, deliberate chimes, just as before. Then the vessel began to fade, its outline blurring, its lights dimming, until there was nothing but empty sea where it had been. I turned my attention to the path. It was dangerous, especially in my injured state, but it was my only chance. Using my phone's last bit of battery for light, I edged out of the cave opening and onto the narrow ledge. The going was slow and terrifying. The path, if it could even be called that, was little more than a series of ledges and footholds in the rock. One slip would mean a fatal fall. The wind tugged at my clothes, threatening to unbalance me, and salt spray made the rock slick beneath my feet, but I pressed on, one careful step at a time. My injured hand was nearly useless, and I had to rely on my right hand and my balance to keep me secure against the cliff face. After what seemed like hours, the path finally curved upward, becoming slightly wider and less exposed. I could see the top of the cliff now, silhouetted against the night sky, just a little further. With a final effort, I pulled myself over the edge and onto solid ground. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. When I finally stood and looked around, I realized where I was, on the far side of Blackrock Point, nearly a mile from the lighthouse. The keeper's cottage was just visible in the distance, a dark shape against the starlit sky. I began walking, cradling my injured hand. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened: the ghost ship, the hidden chamber with its grisly contents, the spectral figure that had sealed me in, and the captain who had shown me the way out. As I approached the cottage, I saw that lights were on inside lights I hadn't left burning. Someone was there. I slowed my pace, suddenly cautious. Who would be in my home at this hour? The supply boat wasn't due. No one was expected. I crept closer, moving to a window where I could peer inside without being seen. What I saw made my blood run cold. 3 men were in my living room, dressed in dark clothing. One was on my computer, typing rapidly. Another was going through my papers, examining them, and then placing selected documents into a bag. The third was talking on a satellite phone, his voice too muffled for me to make out the words. On the table between them was a familiar object, my camera, with its documentation of the Elizabeth Dane. These weren't random intruders. They knew what they were looking for. They knew about the ship, about what I'd discovered. And then I recognized one of them, the man on the phone. I'd seen him before on the mainland. He worked for the Maritime Safety Authority in some administrative capacity. I'd never spoken to him directly, but I'd seen him in the office during my biannual visits, the MSA. The organization that maintained the lighthouse that employed me. They knew about the chamber beneath the shed. They were the ones who had sealed it up, who had erased it from the records. 19 souls for 19 years of prosperity. The words from the chamber wall echoed in my mind. 19 years. The current administration of the MSA had been in place for just over 18 years, following a major restructuring in 2005. A cold certainty settled over me. The smuggling operation might have ended long ago, but whatever dark pact had been made in that chamber, whatever exchange of lives for prosperity, was still in effect. And the current leadership of the MSA was maintaining it, protecting the secret. I backed away from the window, moving as quietly as I could. I needed to get away, to find help, to expose what was happening here. But as I turned, my foot caught on something, a garden tool, left carelessly on the path, and I stumbled, unable to catch myself with my injured hand. I fell hard, a cry of pain escaping my lips before I could stop it. Inside the cottage, voices went silent. Then the front door opened, spilling light onto the path where I lay. "He's here," someone shouted. Outside, I scrambled to my feet and ran, heading for the only place I could think of, the lighthouse tower. If I could get to the radio in the watch room, I could call for help. The Coast Guard, the police. Someone who wasn't part of whatever conspiracy had claimed the Elizabeth Dane and who knew how many other vessels over the years. I heard footsteps behind me, gaining quickly. I was injured, exhausted, in no condition for a chase, but fear gave me speed, driving me toward the tower door. I reached it just ahead of my pursuers, slamming it shut behind me and turning the heavy iron key in the lock. It wouldn't hold them for long. They likely had keys of their own, but it might buy me enough time. I began to climb the spiral staircase, my lungs burning, my vision blurring with fatigue. Behind me, I heard the door crash open, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps on the stairs. "Sullivan," a voice called up the stairwell. "Stop, we just want to talk." I didn't respond, just kept climbing. 108 steps to the watch room. I'd made this climb thousands of times over the years, but never like this, never running for my life. I burst into the watch room, crossing quickly to the radio. My fingers fumbled with the dials, switching to the emergency channel. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I gasped into the microphone. "This is Blackrock Lighthouse. I need immediate assistance. There are intruders." A hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. The man from the MSA stood there, his face grim in the dim light of the watch room. "That's enough, Sullivan," he said, reaching for the radio. I fought him off with my good hand, shoving him backward. "Stay away from me. I know what you did. I found the chamber, the bones." His expression changed, surprise giving way to something harder, more calculating. "So that's what this is about. You've been down there." "I know about the Elizabeth Dane," I said, backing away until I hit the wall. "I know about the sacrifices." He sighed, glancing at his companions who had now entered the room as well. "Then you understand why we can't let you leave, why we can't let you tell anyone." "People will look for me," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. I had no family, few friends. "No one who would miss me quickly enough to matter. No one will find anything suspicious," he replied calmly. "Just another tragedy at sea. A lighthouse keeper who took his boat out in bad weather and never returned." "It happens." One of his companions moved toward me, something glinting in his hand, a syringe. I ducked away, making a break for the stairs to the lantern room above. If I could get outside, onto the gallery that encircled the light. I made it up the stairs and through the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind me. There was no lock, nothing to secure it, but it might slow them down. The Fresnel lens dominated the center of the circular room, its intricate glass prisms catching and amplifying the light from the powerful lamp at its heart. The beam swept out to sea, warning ships away from the deadly rocks. I moved to the door that led to the exterior gallery, pushing it open against the wind that had begun to rise again. Outside, the metal walkway was slick with spray, the railing barely visible in the darkness between sweeps of the light. I stepped out, closing the door behind me. The wind tore at my clothes, threatening to pluck me from my precarious perch. Far below, waves crashed against the base of the lighthouse, sending plumes of white water into the air. I heard the trap door open behind me, voices calling my name. They would find me in moments. I looked out to sea, searching desperately for options, for escape. And there once more was the Elizabeth Dane, closer than ever before, its ghostly form illuminated with each pass of the lighthouse beam. The deck was crowded now with figures, the lost crew, I presumed, 19 souls claimed by treachery and greed. At the bow stood Captain Malone, his face finally visible in the sweeping light. He was younger than I had expected, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the sea. He raised his hand in what might have been greeting or farewell. The door to the gallery burst open behind me. The men from the MSA emerged, their expressions grim. "It's over, Sullivan," the leader said, advancing slowly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked back at the ghost ship. At the captain who had tried to warn me, to help me, who had perhaps been trying to find justice for himself and his crew for over a century. "I see it," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "The Elizabeth Dane." "It's right there." The men exchanged glances. "There's nothing there, Sullivan," one of them said, though there was something in his tone, a hint of uncertainty, of fear. 19 souls, I said, looking directly at the leader. "That's the price, isn't it?" Every 19 years, to keep the lighthouse, to keep the MSA prosperous, to keep whatever dark power you serve satisfied. His face hardened. You don't understand what you're talking about. What's necessary, I understand enough, I replied, and I did suddenly. The pattern was clear. The Elizabeth Dane had been the first sacrifice, and every 19 years since there had been others, ships lured onto the rocks, accidents arranged. Lives traded for prosperity, and now it was time again. The 19th year was approaching. They needed another sacrifice. They needed me. The leader lunged forward, grabbing for my arm. I twisted away, but there was nowhere to go, just the narrow gallery, with the sea far below. And then I heard it, the ship's bell from the Elizabeth Dane, ringing out across the water, 3 chimes as before. But this time they were followed by more a continuous tolling that seemed to fill the air, to vibrate through the very structure of the lighthouse. The men froze, their faces suddenly pale. They could hear it too. "What is that?" one of them whispered, looking out to sea. "There's nothing there, there can't be anything there." But there was. The Elizabeth Dane was moving, its ghostly form gliding across the water toward the lighthouse. And as it approached, it began to change, becoming more solid, more real with each passing moment. The men backed away, their confidence shattered. The leader reached for something in his jacket, a gun, I realized. "Stop this," he commanded, his voice shaking. "Whatever you're doing, stop it now." "I'm not doing anything," I said truthfully. "It's them, the ones you sacrificed, the ones you thought were gone forever." As if in response, the ship's bell rang louder, its tone changing from mournful to angry. The wind picked up, howling around the tower. Waves crashed higher against the rocks, sending spray all the way up to the gallery where we stood. And then I saw them, not just on the ship now, but in the air around the lighthouse. Ghostly figures, barely visible except when caught in the sweep of the light. Men and women in clothing from different eras, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. The victims of Blackrock Point. All those who had been sacrificed for prosperity over the decades. They had returned. The men from the MSA saw them too. One dropped to his knees, covering his face with his hands. Another backed against the wall of the tower, his mouth open in a silent scream. The leader raised his gun, firing wildly at the apparitions. The shots echoed across the water, but had no effect on the ghostly figures that now surrounded us. "You can't fight them," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "You can't run from them. They've been waiting for this moment for a very long time." The spectral forms moved closer, their outlines becoming more distinct. I could see their faces now pale, solemn, marked by the manner of their deaths. Drowning victims mostly, their clothes still dripping phantom seawater, but others showed different wounds, burns, cuts, broken limbs. All the ways that people could die at sea or be made to die. The leader fired again, his hand shaking so badly that the bullet went wide, striking the railing beside me. Then his gun clicked empty, and he threw it aside with a curse. "What do they want?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. I looked at Captain Malone, who now stood, or seemed to stand, on the gallery with us, his ghostly form partially transparent but undeniably present. "Justice," I said simply, "an end to the sacrifices and those responsible held accountable." The leader's face contorted with rage and terror. "You fool, you don't understand what you've done. The pact can't be broken. If the sacrifice isn't made, if the cycle is interrupted." He never finished the sentence. With a sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once, the ghostly figures surged forward. They passed through me as if I wasn't there, a sensation like being plunged into ice water, but nothing more. But when they reached the men from the MSA, they didn't pass through. They enveloped them, their spectral forms merging with the living flesh in a way that defied comprehension. The men screamed horrible, piercing sounds that cut through even the howl of the wind. And then they were moving, stumbling toward the railing of the gallery. Not of their own volition, their faces showed nothing but terror and confusion. But their bodies moved nonetheless, puppeted by the vengeful spirits that had claimed them. I watched, unable to move, as they climbed over the railing one by one. There was a moment of stillness as each stood poised on the edge, and then they fell, their screams fading as they plummeted toward the rocks below. When it was over, I stood alone on the gallery. The wind had died down, the sea calmed. The ghostly figures were gone, all except for Captain Malone, who remained before me, his form already beginning to fade. "Is it over?" I asked him, my voice hoarse. "Truly over," he nodded slowly, his eyes sad but somehow peaceful now meeting mine. He raised his hand in salute, and I returned the gesture with my good hand. Then he was gone, dissolving into the night air. And in the distance, the Elizabeth Dane faded as well, its outline blurring until there was nothing but empty sea where it had been. I sank to my knees on the gallery, exhaustion and pain finally overwhelming me. In the morning, I would call the Coast Guard. I would report what had happened, or some version of it. I would show them the hidden chamber with its grisly contents, the evidence of decades of crimes. But for now, I simply watched as the great beam of the lighthouse swept across the water, guiding ships safely past Blackrock Point. For the first time in over a century, it was truly a beacon of safety, not a lure for sacrifice. The cycle was broken, the dead had found their justice, and I had found the truth about the lighthouse that had been my home for 11 years. I don't know if I'll stay on as keeper after all this, I don't know if I can. But I do know that whatever dark power had held sway here for so long has been banished, its hold broken by the very souls it had claimed. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is bright on the water, I think I can still see the Elizabeth Dane in the distance. Not a harbinger of doom now, but a guardian, ensuring that the waters around Blackrock Lighthouse remain truly safe for all who pass this way.